And we're live. Hello again, SoulSync community. I almost said commune. It's like a fine line, I think, sometimes. Today we have Rob, or this evening we have Rob Morris with us. And the way I've been starting this off, Rob, is basically making some sort of joke about you looking for your soul, and you've ended up in this soulbound sort of space. What would you say got you here, I guess, and maybe a little bit of color on your
Yeah,
background too?
yeah. I mean, I think on some level, I've been looking for my soul for my whole life. And now it's just the latest frontier. So I've been around a long time. I think in the crypto space, we refer to someone as old as me as a Methuselah, which is 1,000-year-old vampire. Um, I started working in emerging tech in the 90s with the rise of the web, the original decentralized network, and I've been around since then, building startups, building companies, acting as an angel investor, an advisor. For example, I'm an advisor to Soulbiz, and generally kind of getting up to mischief. I've been around the crypto space since the very beginning. I have a background hanging out with hackers and cypherpunks and the like, and so one of them sent me the Bitcoin white paper the day that it was dropped. Otherwise, I wouldn't have
That's
noticed it that early.
that's some good clout. The day that it dropped,
Yeah,
that's impressive.
it was, it's funny, like it's easy to forget, right? But this is just a very brief segue, but the world in which we existed at the time the Bitcoin white paper released was like, you could read it, but it was hard to map the claims in the paper into the world that we lived in at the time. A few years later, it became clear that it was something that could happen. But at the time, I was kind of almost like, ooh, I mean, this sounds great, but is it possible? But I digress. So, and I've been building all sorts of companies over the last 20, 30 years. So more recently, actually, like just by complete coincidence leading into the COVID era, I was trying to shift gears away from my primary focus being on consulting and towards something that I found more meaningful. And so for me, this whole COVID era was quite a wonderful reprieve because I get a lot of inbound. I have a big network. I help a lot of people with a lot of things, and everyone went kind of quiet. And so I got an unusual amount of space to be able to explore a lot more than I normally do. And that coincided also with some fairly healthy exits from some of the investment work that I've done. Amongst other things, I was an early investor in ThorChain. So so I found myself in this situation where I could kind of ask myself this question more meaningfully, and it was easy to see that I didn't need to do anything in particular. And so what should I do? It turns out that's a really hard question, harder than I'd imagined. And where I ended up was what I'm working on at the moment with FunDAOmental. Now that's adjacent to soulbound tokens, but it's a broader mission. What I'm really trying to do there is I've observed that a lot of the problems we have in the world that are difficult to solve, I think underneath all of the surface noise, those are essentially coordination problems. I was looking at the increasing rise of these, the world that we're going into, where increasingly we actually really desperately need better coordination. And there are systematic issues there that if we don't solve them, they're going to become more and more catastrophic. And so I eventually led myself to this question, which is like, what would I regret not doing in 10 years' time? That I, for example, might have the skills, resources, unique perspectives, and so on to contribute to. And the thing that came out the other answer is what I'm working on with FunDAOmental, which is essentially how do we remediate the tragedy of the commons? How do we explore coordination structures and approaches that don't rely on these big monolithic hierarchical coordination structures that tend to produce over time? They work, but they tend to produce an uneven power fabric and unfair outcomes and repudiate a lot of people's autonomy and choice, which produces this whole big tug of war. Like, for example, if you have like 1 million people and you say you all have to follow one rule, of course, a bunch of people are going to then argue over what the rule is because they want the rule that benefits them. They're going to feel like the people who are arguing with them are sort of their enemy, but it's really the system that's the enemy of everyone there. And so how do we do better is essentially the question I'm trying to answer. Now, soulbound tokens are very interesting, or the approach of having more specifically a meaningful identity and persona that you could use in high autonomy, high privacy systems is, I think, a really important piece of the puzzle. And soulbound tokens is one of the approaches to that. And so here I am. A bit of a long answer, but I hope I got there.
No, that's good. I was happy just sponging away. It's really been interesting talking to different people in the SoulSync community because there's quite like a diverse coverage of how they're thinking about SPTs, soulbounds, and the different types.
Yeah.
And there is one central theme though, which really is this idea for like identity on chain. And I guess that comes off the back of the inability or generalized inability to transfer the tokens. So you start to think about, well, no one's buying a token to hold to sell. And so why do they want these things? And you have to go and start layering on, I guess, meaning a different way, which is a natural progression, I think, to some sort of hybrid model for DAOs or some sort of soulbound sort of model for DAOs, which I think is really interesting. And I think that's what got me excited about it. When you talk about the tragedy of the commons, I guess what do you think that, how would you describe that? And what do you think do you think it arises out of evil, or do you think that like the notion of evil, or do you think that a lot of the bad stuff that we see in the world is kind of not so much evil or like some agenda, but just a natural outcome of when you have models that support it?
I mean, I guess in some sense, the notion of evil is subjective, right? And so what people usually often mean by evil is something that's really in high violation of their own value systems and beliefs about how the world should be. The definition I would use for evil is, I think that evil flows from when people are very determined not to have to update their map of the world, and they want the reality to conform to their existing beliefs and their existing frame of reference. And I think from there flows most of what I would call evil. And so, I don't think really anyone, to the most part, there's of course exceptions, there's a percentage of people who are malicious, but to the most part, people don't set out to be evil, right? Like there's a reason why anyone's behaving like they do. Like there's a lot of trauma in the world, right? And people tend to do to others what is done to them. Hurt people. When you dig underneath the hurt, you can almost always find why someone's behaving in a certain way. And you could see that if you could heal that injury, they might stop behaving in that way. Now, of course, it's not that easy because some people, some people are dangerous and injured, and you can't see a clear path to being able to help them with that. It's unreasonable to expect that they'd be able to be healed adequately. And even for people who want to do it, it's a life work. So when we get to things like the tragedy of the commons, I extrapolate this a bit further than the traditional definition. So the traditional definition is referring to this idea of specific shared resources, and where individuals behave selfishly, they deplete that resource. I think that the tragedy of the commons also applies to things like arms race technologies, where, so for example, AI, where you have a technology that provides a benefit to then if it's used, it would provide a benefit, but it externalizes, it has some negative externalities. Then if you have two opponents, neither of them want to use it, but both of them know that if their opponent uses it, they're going to beat them. And then once they've beaten them, they'll be able to do whatever they want. They'll both pick up essentially that tool and use it, even though it's destructive, in order to protect themselves. And so the only way we get around problems like tragedy of the commons is positive sum coordination. It's essentially a game theory problem if you get down to it, right? Because the only way both people aren't going to pick up that weapon is if they have confidence that neither of them are going to pick it up, because they both understand that that's better for everyone. And you can that's going to require coordination, because people aren't going to just trust, you're not picking up the thing that will allow you to kill me. They're going to need like a degree of certainty about that in order for them to feel safe. Now, the best way for them to get that certainty is in the context of a safe and intimate relationship. And I think that applies on-chain and off-chain. You need trust. You need a sense of belonging and shared values with other people. From that, a great sense of safety, belonging arises. And if you think about the people in your own life, there are some people who you would trust quite deeply, I'm sure. And you would have confidence that they're not going to try and murder you in your sleep or something if they think they're going to be able to get your money on quite a deep level. And so I think that kind of fabric of trust that builds up from intimacy and positive sum games, reciprocity, which is why I'm called the recipromancer, because I'm dealing with the magic of reciprocal relationships. This is
I was wondering that.
the tools.
I like that.
It's the root of the Latin word reciprocus and the suffix mancer. So mancer is a practitioner of the school of magic, and reciprocus literally means to and fro or back and forth, but it translates to two-way street, or this idea of a relationship where it's both ways.
I like it. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, like if you just appear on an island and it's you and your friend and there's a gun in the middle, you kind of like, oh, maybe like this is useful for us to hunt stuff or survive. But if you like teleport into an island and it's you and some complete stranger, you're like, grab the gun.
Yeah, maybe I should have the gun so I can keep it safe so nobody gets hurt. And now that I have the gun, maybe you should just do a little bit, still fairly, but just do a little bit more what I say. I'm not threatening you or anything. I'm just saying that, like, I'm not going to give you the gun back, and you get like a sort of an attrition over time, right? That comes from that.
Yep. Now my son inherits the gun.
Yeah.
If assuming a son teleports there, if it's depending who started. Yeah, it's a slippery slope, and I think that's yeah. I mean, I'm seeing more and more people think this way, and I guess it's probably circles of who I'm hanging out with to some extent, but I think it's also just slowly the realization for the technology that we're playing with is kind of seeping in, where it's like, well, why do we have these hierarchical structures? Well, we came out of the caves, we were the monkeys, we were the tribes, we were the villages, countries.
We needed them once upon a time.
We needed them. Yeah, and there wasn't really like an alternative. There wasn't some way to easily like outside of a really strong social sort of value network passed on maybe with generations or something.
I think it flows from the system dynamics of the environment that we live in to a degree. So there's some credible theories that before the agricultural revolution, the way that most society worked was essentially like this. But ever since then, we have really relied heavily upon coercive controlled structures to get everything done for the most part. And there's probably there's arguments for that being the case back then, is that, well, people didn't really have any wealth. There wasn't like, violence wasn't very attractive. It was a high risk, low reward activity. And so largely an unnecessary lever. It didn't give you anything. As soon as we had the agricultural revolution, ever since, we've had large amounts of like essentially immovable wealth, and there's an incentive to violence. And so everything else kind of seems to have flowed from there. So I think that, to your point, yes, like we're on the frontier, as people in crypto like to say, we're early. And so, the people that we might choose to hang around with who are also on the frontier, they're living in a future state compared to most people. But I think more deeply what we're dealing with is a paradigm shift here, right? Like, I think it's already true, and this has big implications if we think about it. I think it's already true that the advantage that comes from momentum is now a slight advantage. It's like a slight advantage over the benefits of protectionism. Now, that hasn't been true for most of our lives. The reason why VCs use a model that builds scale around a moat is because there was a bigger benefit to having the protectionism than there was to the momentum. Now we're starting to see that the momentum that comes from, for example, open interoperable protocols that are permissionless, that allow anyone to participate, is out competing the protection that comes from like closed IP, blah, blah, blah. And so that's very interesting. That has implications for sovereign governments. Some of those have been explored in popular books like the Network State or the Sovereign Individual. It's going to erode the power of these like institutional, monolithic, hierarchical structures that project power down a pathological hierarchy from the top to the bottom, and allows an opportunity for each rung above the other rung to kind of benefit itself slightly at the cost of those below it. Now, of course, we've kind of had that for a long time. Usually it tends to oscillate between extremes. You know, when the system gets too unfair, too distorted, when the power fabric is too imbalanced, then the life for many people becomes not meaningfully better than death. And there's a threshold that people will reach where they'll rise up and they'll revolt, they'll fight, and there'll be a revolution. And we've seen that throughout history. Then there comes a brief moment of chaos, and then see like a cascade consensus failure, which is what happens when no one can agree on anything, and is what happens if you have too much decentralization with no coordination mechanisms. That will produce a particular result, which is that someone will step up. They'll say, I have some solutions, I have some answers. If you just follow me, listen to me, blah, blah, blah. And people will willingly give them that power because they want there to be a solution, because they're desperate for it. And then we begin the whole thing again. And so we kind of end up with a new regime, and then power slowly accumulates. So I'd say that, like, probably, going back about 10 years, even up the last 10 years, perhaps leading up to COVID, perhaps even now, we've been in sort of like a golden age. It's a sweet spot between those two, but where we are certainly heading in a direction that's becoming less and less beneficial for more and more people. And it's like slow, a little bit worse every year, and hard to kind of nail ways. But the thing is, people can feel it, right? People feel the tension. And so that's why people at the frontier, they're like, oh, something's wrong here. Let's explore it. And that's why we're finding more and more people who understand the nature of this. And so when you boil it all down, it's like this, no one's being malicious. It really is just the tragedy of the commons writ large. And if we're going to fix it, what we need is better coordination, essentially. And to my point about trust before, you can't possibly have these high trust relationships with people in a digital context, which is more and more about interacting with people, if you can't have some kind of report, some sense of who they are, if there's not some accountability around that identity. But maybe we would benefit greatly from being able to decouple that effect from people's physical real world, meet space identity. And I think it's doable for what it's worth.
The meet space identity. Yeah, I am fairly aligned with what you're saying. I guess the part of the trap or pit that I think people fall into when looking at this, I guess, enabling technology of blockchain is that there's the classic thing of looking at, seeing it as a financial instrument only, seeing it as dollars, but on this thing, and it's not by the government, and like not going that step further to look at it as like a technology that can help establish trustless interaction. And then you can kind of go the first step and say, well, you can have a smart contract, hold the funds, pay out two parties, you can rely on that to perform. And then you kind of stretch that to what you're talking about here, which is whether it's through the use of soulbounds or whether it's the use of like a combination of different soulbounds, NFTs, contribution, voice, like connected accounts, little indicators of someone's presence in the real world. It starts, I think, to get pretty murky pretty fast for a lot of people when you're trying to take them on that journey, I guess, in like a session, like you can kind of go, crypto's this and you can do this and now it's got that, and it's all like money stuff. It seems like it makes sense, but then you go and you can apply a whole new business structure kind of thing to the whole world, and it's like quite an
future state
extreme
stuff It's future
It's
state stuff. And so it's quite understandable that the vast majority of people don't live in a world where that seems necessarily useful or something like they want. The problem is that there are many technologies that are going to change the dynamics of the world we live in. And that's happening already. And as that accelerates and those changes start to manifest, then some of these innovations are going to become very necessary indeed. Now, are they convenient? No. Like, it's very comfortable dealing with what we're familiar with, but we already now, like right now, we live in a world where it's reality that we have highly manipulative predictive technologies that can take really just the smallest smearing of data about you, just tens of data points really, and be quite predictive about what you're interested in, who you're likely to hang out with, various views you might hold, how you might vote, and all sorts of other things. And this is not even new. Like that level is not even new. But we're moving towards a world where it's even more dangerous, right? As you start to see the rise of like large language model AIs, you can start to see just how powerful the ability to have data on somebody and then predict and control them is. If you can target a message to someone in a way that will appeal to them, you've just gotten rid of, for example, representative democracy entirely, because there's no longer any accountability. You can just twist whatever you're saying so that they're going to agree with it, right? And so we have like this whole set of problems coming down the pipeline as these things start to become more and more commonplace and figure out how to wield them. And we can no longer rely on the old institutions and ways to keep us safe. However, we don't live in that world yet. As people who live in the future and the frontier, you can see that it's coming. Actually, we still live in the old world right now. So we still get to enjoy the old ways for a while. And that means that people that don't live on the frontier, it won't make any sense to them yet. That doesn't mean we shouldn't work.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I mean, it's one of the things I've been thinking a lot about more recently is there is like an extreme, and it is a journey to kind of wrap your head around that potential, especially because it's not present and it's largely a hypothetical. And to explain it, you have to explain things like maybe yeah, like tragedy of the commons. Refresh my memory on what that is. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. If I agree with that being a sensible description of like the world today, now I can start to think about how it could be different. And it's like the biggest challenge I think between now and that future state where things are maybe done in a way that makes more people net like vote at the end of the day that they're more happy or that they're going in a direction that they like. Maybe that's a loose metric for it. It's like, how do you see, what do you think needs to happen to get there? Because I don't think it's going to be something where yelling in the street, hey, listen, this stuff's cool and it could be good for you. Like you might have a more enjoyable time playing with it.
Yeah.
I think it's like one of the big challenges that the industry faces.
Yeah, it is. Look, it's more challenging even than that, because it's not like you could like adequately explain all of the pieces. Like, let's say you could adequately explain all of the pieces of the puzzle to someone, which is already unlikely. Even people like us, right? We're missing a heap of pieces of the puzzle in terms of our own cognitive models, and maybe we're aware of that, or maybe we're not. But even putting that problem aside, there's the problem of perspectives or theory of mind. And the thing is that a lot of the things we're talking about now, they require someone to be able to hold a higher theory of mind or higher perspectives that they can't get there on their own. Usually how that happens is somebody who can hold that higher perspective that can contain the previous perspectives lifts that person up, and they can temporarily then hold that perspective, and then with enough practice they can start to hold it without help. Now the problem with that is that you can't even you're blind to the thing entirely. You can't even comprehend what it means until you can hold a perspective that can make sense of it. And like I don't know, a classic example is like, which is may or may not be true, but people that people use, is that when the white man came to indigenous settlements in their tall ships, that the indigenous people didn't even see the ships because they couldn't recognize that those are something that people were sailing in. Like that wasn't they had no basis on which to understand that. Now, that could just be an egregious imperialist lie, maybe they fully understood it. Putting that aside, it's a good kind of shortcut to explain this problem of perspectives. And so I often find that when I'm describing the work that I do with FunDAOmental, I have to explain it differently to each person. Now, I have a great, I guess you could say like an expert heuristic at doing this because of the things I've had to do professionally over a long time. And so I do explain it differently to each person, and I'll target that to the person's perspective and the understanding that they have, and build a bridge for them so they can kind of understand. And with you, it was easy, right? Like you already have a lot of knowledge. So I can just, talk about the mechanics of it and point to it. With a lot of people, it's much harder, and so that makes things much, much harder for us. Now, to actual practical solutions, it means that there isn't a version of this where we educate the public and then they get the point and then they start thinking like us. That's not how this works. You get some people at the edges with that kind of thing. The way this works is we create systems and products and applications and networks that work and work well, that are attractive, and they work better than things that people already have in their lives.
Yep.
And that invites use. And then when people use these things, they happen to have side effects. They change the system dynamics in such a way that new norms emerge, and so on. The internet, as a simple example, was the beginning of cheap communication with anyone in the world. And it's profoundly transformed the face of the world in just a couple of decades and how we do everything. We've come to deeply rely on a lot of the things that it enables already. And it would be an alien world for most people to go back to how I grew up in the 90s, before we had mobile phones and social media and the internet. And that's somebody who grew up on, with modems, with bulletin boards, messing around with computers from a young age, trying to write software, rewrite games. So my friends thought that I'd made it when, just changed the name on it, all of that stuff that you do as a kid, right? Like, so that's how we get there. It's make stuff that's useful with side effects.
Yeah, I think it's well known now because there's countless amount of attempts that if you go and I kind of view it maybe as like if you try and migrate people to something based on their values, it's actually, well, I guess on their like the things they say they value, it turns out not being the best way to do it. Privacy is a great example.
It's one of the best. Everyone says they want it. No one's willing to pay for it. No one even moves to the platform for free that gives them more privacy just for that reason.
Yep. But if you think about privacy on chain and some of the cool stuff you can do, there's actually, I think, big unlocks of products you could create that can't exist on any kind of centralized infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Even
and
sharing.
There are solutions, sorry to cut you off, and there are solutions with natural advantages that solve. So there's a lot of problems that kind of sit at a tension point where things have changed and there's some new problem and it's starting to get like itchy, and people are starting to go, oh, maybe I have this problem, maybe it's something I want a solution for. And so there's always, a changing configuration of those things. And so targeting products to those pain points is a really effective strategy as well, because it's like an unsolved pain point. And there are loads of those, and more of them are coming every day. Like we spend most of our time in digital contexts now, but we're using all of these 2D abstract systems. So then you have this idea of the metaverse, and the promise of the metaverse is it can introduce a spatial interface that creates a richer, more intuitive context for people. The problem is the vast majority of metaverse products are completely missing the point. They think it's about making a game, or they think it's about making something that's immersive. I think the true power of that is spatial interfaces, user interfaces that use a concept of space that people can understand like that are deeply intuitive and that create a sense of kind of shared space with other people. And so I think that there's just this really deep pain point. Like take a Zoom, right? Zoom is kind of a shitty spatial interface. Like it's much better to be face-to-face with someone. But if we can't do that, this is maybe better than nothing. The studies showed that just a phone call is more intimate and creates a greater sense of being with someone than a
Over
Zoom call
Zoom?
does. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
interesting. Um, I wouldn't be able to reference where I saw it, but I saw something about children um, finding Zoom to be like they were asked, I think this is loose, but I think they were asked if they had hung out with their friends recently, and they would say yes if it was like even if it was only over Zoom, like they were seeing it as a
Yeah.
one-to-one kind of thing.
And look, that is true. But if you imagine that there's a gradient of feeling like you actually gotten to hang out with your friends, that
Yeah,
would be down in the bottom third.
yeah.
And like one thing I found is that, like, during lockdown, I have a VR headset, and I hung out and played mini golf with some friends in that and just talked shit and putted some mini golf balls. And when I remember that time, it feels like I just was physically there with them,
Mm,
because it was like a more contextualized activity, as an example. And if I think about like a long phone call with a friend, having a D&M, walking around, you remember where were you sitting on this rock, having the chat. So
yeah,
there's
okay.
a rich context for the conversation that feels more intimate. And the thing is, like, a lot of these children, they actually know how to do this. Like I see kids, in the 5 to 15 year range, they hop on Roblox, right? And they hang out and they mess around in some space somebody made while they talk to their friends. They don't do a video call, right?
Oh,
So
you've got like a I saw a link that you had for uh Guild. Is that your thing? Is that something you're involved with?
no, I mean, it's not my thing, but I think that Guild is a really valuable piece, Lego piece, Guild XYZ. Same as Joke DAO, for example, which is on-chain governance essentially, and they both pair nicely together. Then we've got like the decentralized identity slash uh, um, slash soulbound token stuff, like say Verida is the example of that, or Disco, or other solutions like that. So the yeah, like, Guild is great because it's a sovereign community graph. It means that you can publish these essentially public. This is how you get this role. This is the things that you need to accomplish, which is actually like a quite interesting side effect, because now community members, it's transparent for community members what they need to do to get something. Secondly, the graphics sits outside of these platforms where you can get deplatformed. So if your chat is all in Discord, for example, and then Discord deplatforms your entire community, you could say, well, everyone who has a guild role, you can now come into this Telegram chat. Nothing, nothing's gone particularly wrong.
Right.
And so I think that that's a really important piece of the puzzle, right? Because it's bringing more sovereignty and transparency to communities.
That's awesome. Um, it'd be really cool, I think, if we switch gears into governance.
Yeah.
I suspect you might have some thoughts on it. Maybe a blend of like capital raising, but when it comes to DAOs or their similar counterparts. So like
Yeah.
I'm seeing a lot of either projects raised and they've, through the ICO phase a couple of years ago, and it's kind of the trend is sort of continuing where DAOs are raising, but they're taking decent amounts of capital from VCs, and although it might be a small percentage when it comes to active voters, that small percentage ends up being 15, 20, 25% of the active voting pool, because they're not just trading it and taking a punt or holding it. They're like very much building a large position and intend
Yeah.
to use their influence.
Conviction bets.
What's that?
They have a conviction bet, and so they play an active role in the
Yeah,
in the
in shaping it.
ecosystem. Yeah.
And I guess on the one hand, that's fine. They've got a conviction. They want to shape it in have their influence. But I guess when you talk about who has voting power and what happens to that over time when it can kind of consistently skew the direction of a DAO, depending on what the DAO is trying to achieve, that could be problematic. And I've been scratching my mind about how you might try and address that. Because on the one hand, you might want capital, and on the other hand, you don't want to get pinged for launching a financial product and getting a Wells notice if it's got exposure to the US or similar here. And it's just it's a tricky one, chicken and the egg. How do you?
It's tricky and it's simple. I mean, incentives work, and it's sort of perverse incentives. And so there is a deal with the devil. I say that, I don't mean to be rude to VCs when I say this, but there's a deal with the devil when you take money from any large amount of money from any one group, because you're just giving them a lot of leverage, and each group will generally act in their own self-interest. And in order to create a situation where groups act in a positive sum game, you need really quite explicit coordination for that. You need systems that help to incentivize a positive sum game, or more clearly, help to make it possible, help to create a system of, like, you can't have a David and Goliath who can easily play a positive sum game, right? Because they're not on an equal playing field. There's not an equilibrium of power there. It's the gun on the island example we were talking about before. And so over time, that will distort it further. And so essentially, it's simple in the sense that if a project accepts this trade-off, they've created a perverse incentive and provided leverage. And part of what happens after that is approximately deterministic. And so the solution is not to need to do that. Of course, it's easier said than done. However, I think that there are a lot of things that we can do to change the dynamics of the situation at different levels. Depends how far back we want to go or how close to the coalface, so that this is not necessary. For starters, we're seeing in VC land, we're seeing a much greater degree of non-diluting and controlling capital, more than we've ever seen before. Actually, like a VC in whatever Uniswap, for example, they have less control than they've ever had before, not more. It's more visible. And so there's a development towards that being a fairer system. But if we go all the way to if we take all the way the steps back, in a zero-sum economy that pits us against each other, and knowing that humans lean collective and communal, but they have to have their needs met first. So if you take whatever a single mother in the poverty line, and you say, look, I'll give you $1,000, which is a substantial amount of money to her. She's got 3 kids. She's barely making enough to put food on the table. Maybe she doesn't have enough to put food on the table. And you say, look, you can have $1,000, or I can give $1,000 to 100 other people like you, which is literally 100 times the benefit. My prediction is two things. Most of the people in that situation, men, women, otherwise, would take $1,000. Most of them would want to. Now, if they were entrepreneurial and clever, they
What was two? Most of them would take it.
And most of them wouldn't want. Most of them would want to be able to choose option B, where 100 other people like them get $1,000 instead.
Yeah, I reckon for 1,000, I think people would try not to take the 1,000 if it was 1,000. But if you said 10, I'd be like, yeah.
It's just a number that's indexed to our own situation,
I'm like,
right?
Now
For some people,
why
they'd be
do I
like,
think that's the case? Yeah.
For some people, they'd be like, oh, I mean, if the number was $1 billion, and sure,
I've lost your camera.
Sorry. What I'll do is I'll just switch it back over to my other camera.
Okay. Yeah, no, I get your point though. I think that it's a.
Sorry, we've got an abrupt change of video quality here, but I will.
That's all right. Still look good. Yeah.
So this is the point, right? And like, if it was me in that situation, then I'd say me every time. And I can afford to do this, but putting it aside, saying that it was not me with my resources and blah blah blah, just me with my skills in that situation, I would go, great. let's choose $1,000 for 100 people, but I then go and say like, hey guys, we've gotten this benefit for you. Let's just take 10% of that and put it into a fund for people like us to create a buffer for whoever needs it the most. And let's collect on that. And if we do something like that, we can actually all benefit. In that particular case, I could get my $1,000 because actually we've multiplied the total amount by 100 already. And so there's plenty to go around. Everyone can have 9,900 and something. So there's ways to solve this, but it requires coordination. It requires a sort of some game and a sense of community. And so my esoteric and kind of important point here is that people all largely lean that way. There's exceptions like psychopathy and sociopathy and so on, and narcissism, which by the way have useful, productive roles to play in society. Like a sociopath can do things that somebody who doesn't have that kind of traits would crush them, and they can do things that are useful. And sometimes that's exactly the person you need in a job. It's not always bad. Of course, you might not want to, trust them in certain situations either.
Yeah. But, someone thinking about how to maintain the security of a network might thrive.
Or someone where the thing that they need to do is retrench 1,000 people and, not spend years having PTSD, right? Like a psychopath, sociopath can probably just do that and they're not going to sleep over it. Whereas somebody who doesn't have that might very well be debilitated for a period of time to do that. And so there's pros and cons to every trait. And in the end, this is one of humanity's great strengths, is we have this huge spread of different traits. Some people wake up early, some people sleep in at night. Well, that's pretty great. If a predator wanders in, during the night, somebody might be up to alert everyone. Oh, but if the place catches on fire in the morning when everyone's sleeping, it's quite useful that you've got people with those different traits that can work together. But of course, it means that we have to be able to tolerate differences with people. And so when that comes back to like this decision that projects have to make, I think that they also face the perverse incentive. Like as a founder, and this is true of people who have been creating things through all of human history, existing in an extractive game where you having to play selfishly, where that's the rules of the game are selfish, right? In that coordination system, you have to be quite unusual to play a positive sum game, right? And so most people don't. And this is problematic. And so these founders, of course, faced with the decision to do something that's like entirely in line with their principles long term and most likely to succeed, but could do something that would allow them to enrich themselves in the short term and give them much more control. Many of them aren't going to choose that. And you can hardly even blame them for that. So it takes a special kind of person to say, no, I'm going to do this thing that's in the long-term benefit. It could be someone who understands how that's also in their self-interest over the long term.
Yep.
Or it could be somebody who is just crazy. But it's unusual. So that's the essential problem that we face. I would encourage any founder, any person starting a DAO, to think about what's more important to them, the thing they say they're there to do, or personal enrichment. And I would humbly suggest that if it's the latter, there might be merit in being more honest about it. And if it's the former, there might be merit in not introducing perverse leverage on your mission that will actively get in the way. And that might not be worth the cost.
Right, because if the opportunity to create something that scales very well and rewards value to where the value is being produced at like an individual level and at scale, if that's only achievable by having that, I guess, non-perverse skewed structure to start with, then it's either you don't have it or you structure it that way. And even if you're looking after yourself as well, that actually kind of checks out. Like if that's the pathway it needs to go for it to work, the opportunity is not having it or having something that's more balanced, but it's actually still, fun to do.
And looking after yourself in a reasonable and proportional way to bring value into the world. Because I remember like a lot of these things never happen if the founders can't do it. And so if they're too stingy with themselves, and they'll fall over. Like there's definitely an equilibrium in there. And my experience is that good communities, good initiatives and projects, like everyone's really supportive of that because everyone can feel it when something's a positive sum game and they love it,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And they get these passionate, self-perpetuating foundations around that. Honestly, like just in my case, just building companies that encourage high autonomy and safety and respect. I watch people literally heal trauma in those environments. It's that rare, right? Like it's that rare to have just an environment where you feel respected, like you belong, like you can contribute something value, that's appreciated, and have your back, covered by other people,
Yep.
where you can be yourself. Like this kind of combination of things, like people find that profound. They find it, and they're willing to fight for it. But if there's a hint of that being just another bullshit doublespeak lie, or there's some other agendas, the more that just starts to erode it. It chips away at it from the edges, and eventually it becomes something else. And so that is essentially the game. Are there easy answers? No,
Yep.
it's all hard stuff.
Definitely. I agree. I think it's kind of straightforward, even though there's hard problems. The irony is it's like if you're going to build a thing that lets lots of people have a fulfilling role and have their needs met and value to mix around, that's literally what you need to solve hard problems is lots of people to be in that picture. So I don't know, I'm fairly bullish on that being a not unrealistic pathway for us.
And look, it's like I have a saying that you'll hear me say if you know me for any period of time, you hear me roll out from time to time, which is that comfort is the death of joy.
Comfort is a deadly joy.
It's the death of joy.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and what I'm saying at a deeper level um, is that fear, and responding from fear is the death of joy. And so that applies in many different ways. But one of the ways in which it applies is that when, for example, a founder chooses the certainty of having a big lever, which by the way is a hierarchical control structure. It's not a cooperative coordination mechanic, right? Because like, who are they to direct the lever better, right? Why can't they coordinate with other people? The people are afraid, they like control, they want to keep themselves safe, and so they seek that comfort. That comfort is the death of the freedom of the thing that they're trying to do, which they might care very deeply about. And so in that sense, comfort is the death of joy. And also just in the sense of our own personal journey, if we stay comfortable, safe, buy that extra car, keep that cushy job, never step out into the fire to do the thing that sets our soul alight, that thing that gets us up at night. It's a shadow of a life of what we could live. It's so satisfying to build communities that can help people to solve some problem in the world. Like it truly is. It's a much, much more challenging way to live though. And a lot of people are like, yeah, that's not what I want. And that's fair enough. But for the people who feel called to that, right, like I would, again, humbly suggest that they consider more cooperative ways of getting there that don't create such leverage on them. And when we take money from people, it almost inevitably we create leverage. And that leverage may be used benevolently, but it may not. And it's quite hard to undo the dynamics that emerge from those decisions after you've done it, as expedient as it is. And look, and again, like this is hard stuff because if you need resources to get something off the ground, and we often do, and you don't take those resources, then it may very well be that you can't get that thing into the world, and you might care very deeply about that. So there's certainly trade-offs. I'm not saying don't raise money. I'm not saying don't deal with VCs even. I'm just saying think about what you're there to accomplish and whether or not the thing that you're doing is in alignment with it or not, and then proceed cautiously, knowing that the comfortable, safe option will often be also the death of the thing that you cared about.
Yeah, or at least it increases the odds of it. I think when you're talking about VCs earlier, it did make me think maybe there is a bit of a social binder or glue to that where companies thinking about raising can see what the VCs are doing. Because you're right, the votes on chain are transparent, and the VCs want to allocate to good, strong projects with high potential, and those projects probably have more choice, and so they can choose their VCs at least to some extent. So that yeah might be
I mean,
a way of
I have a lot of friends who are VCs, and so I don't want to sound too down on them either. I mean, actually, like VCs are very productive members of communities. Largely, they roll their sleeves up to get stuff done. They're usually
definitely.
looking to play a form of a positive sum game that increases the value of the ecosystem. And there's a lot of really good examples of VCs doing that very productively and very helpfully. I mean, the ThorChain ecosystem, one of the most important groups is essentially a VC made up of core community members and so on, called Nine Realms, and they do an incredible job of rallying that community, and like that's just one of many examples. So it can be very productive. The problem is that the business model of a traditional VC, at least, this is not necessarily true of the investment DAOs and so on, is that you make, for example, 100 bets, and you must have value capture lever on all of those 100 bets. So out of the 100 bets, it's going to be like 3 to 5% maybe that do like a 20 to 30x multiple on valuation. And so in order for that business model to work, you need the 100 bets, and you need to make sure that you will capture the value of each of those 100 bets, which means that the whole setup is about capturing value. Yep. So even though they can be very productive, that's not the right tool for every kind of organization. If an organization's a scale startup and everyone's in alignment about capturing value together, then that's a wonderful partnership that can be incredibly valuable. If you're trying to build, some public goods thing that, around a mission that you deeply care about, you might want to consider whether or not that having a large organization that's interested in scaling that thing aggressively to value capture a portion of the returns it can generate is actually in alignment with your goals, even slightly, because it may very well not be. And that's the point where I think it's a bad call.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's a good point to point out, obviously it's not all VCs. It's like the VC that you think of in your head when someone says VC, that for some reason we all think is evil. Obviously they're not. And you can still structure.
They're smart and intelligent and insightful and charming people, but incentives work.
Yeah, and that goes back to the start of what evil was probably a bit strong, but how we started that off. I think we'll probably wrap it there. I think this is like a bit, we skewed a fair way out of a soulbound focus, but I have a feeling that it's right up the center for people interested in soulbound. So hopefully, if you're watching it, you feel like I'm sure you've seen some different bits of value, and I think it's like soulbounds to me are just maybe one of the pathways that we can start to unlock what we can do with blockchains, moving away from essentially capital being incentives and things like that, where you can have votes weighted based on all sorts of things. Yeah. Were you at the event, and indicators like that?
I think there are much better models than token bound, token weighted voting. Absolutely, and sovereign tokens help enable some of those.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see. I mean, if you've got thoughts and you're watching this, just poke my pencil at you. Drop them in the chat and let us know, because I think, I suspect there'll be hybrid type things, or maybe if this under this amount, this token, whatever. Anyway, great to have a chat, and thanks for jumping on. I had a lot of fun. This was really cool.
Yeah, my pleasure, James. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Boop.